Welcome. Dobry den, dobry večer, dobro dня. Thank you for staying with us and for joining this very, I think, important panel. Just another announcement that Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur will be joining us after this panel, which is 2:40. And hi, Brian. So we just need to be kind of tight on the schedule. I said that I will not go into lengthy bios, particularly of Andy, who's the moderator. He can address everybody else. Needless to say, Brian has got several decades. No, excuse me. Andy has got several decades of expertise in communications and public affairs and public relations. He took over the presidency of the Chamber of Commerce. Let's see, that was in 2015, and has been very active. I think Ukraine is very blessed that there are several institutions that are really focused on this, on Ukraine and the economy and overall development. And of course, it would be the American Chamber of Commerce, the US-Ukraine Business Council, and the European Business Association. And as well, in terms of the media sphere, Brian Bonner from the Kyiv Post, who is very diligent and writes wonderful editorials. Also, Jim Brooke puts out a newsletter. And then, of course, we have Anders Aslund, who has been tracking and encouraging and involved with Ukraine. And also, of course, Ambassador Roman Waschuk. So I trust, and my hope is that our effort with this kind of a conference really is to complement all the work that you all have been doing for quite some time. I think I was challenging this group to identify, well, we know what the problems are, and we might want to talk about maybe like what we have done. And Ambassador Waschuk actually wrote an interesting article about, I think it was the 12 lessons that we should have learned about what we didn't quite get right, but also in terms of what is it that we, particularly in the private sector, could do to promote economic development. And beyond this panel discussion, I hope to continue discussions with you in terms of putting forth specific recommendations to our Congress and administration. Anders is a member of the Friends of Ukraine Network Economic Task Force, and we are pledging to be much more active in that sector. So thank you. So again, this will be just the beginning, I hope, of our conversation and working together. Andy, I turn it over to you.
Well, brilliant. Thank you, Nadia, and good afternoon or good evening, everybody who's joining us, either whichever side of the Atlantic. It's a glorious evening here in Ukraine. And I think there's a lot going on. You've been reading the news and seeing what's happened. I think today's focus really, as Nadia said, it's really focusing on the economic development, what it is that needs to be done to boost this economic development. And who better to have this than this truly stellar panel? So, Roman Waschuk, who's been over 5 years in Ukraine as ambassador, Anders Aslund, who knows the region exceptionally well, Anna Derevyanko, over 20 years experience working, with business, and Brian Bonner himself, a man who really does understand, and who we read every day, and who gives us probably the #1 source of information in English about Ukraine's global voice. So last week we had quite a historic visit. Secretary Blinken was in town. I did have the opportunity to speak with the secretary during a COVID compliance online roundtable. It was, I know a lot of the speculations come out into the media, what was said there, but I can say what I said. And I did focus, also I mentioned, the success stories, that there are many companies that have believed in Ukraine, that have entered the market, and that are working in Ukraine successfully. And I think, it is really giving this confidence to the companies to really boost that. So maybe, Ambassador Waschuk, if we start off, I think, there's a lot we will focus on, what needs to be done. But if we start off, what has Ukraine done well over the last 30 years in terms of, boosting economic activity, economic growth? Ambassador.
Well, thank you, Andy. I think Ukraine has, essentially by being a non-repressive democratic state, has allowed lots of flowers to bloom. Now, of course, some parts of the garden have been walled off by oligarchs, and they've perhaps gone a bit monoculture there. But in the non-oligarchic segments of the economy, those particularly focused on innovation, Ukraine has produced new companies, companies that are globally competitive, especially in the IT field, but also a range of domestic sort of semi-infrastructural players, the Nova Poshtas of the world, that actually provide Ukrainians with world-class service in their own country. And these are things you start taking for granted in Ukraine and then realize you can only get them at very expensive rates when you return to places like North America. So I think a lot of that positive development has actually been a kind of development through neglect. Wherever you haven't created a state committee or something, Ukrainians have been smart enough and entrepreneurial enough to develop solutions and develop opportunities. In my Canadian work, worked on a whole range of business environment issues, and the one where quite a bit was happening was on free trade. And we had the signing of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement in 2016. We then had a project to facilitate trade. We then had to bird dog implementation. That meant discovering the practices of Black Sea seaports customs offices, which was interesting. The whole thing was designed to favor Ukraine. It certainly has increased exports, but there's been no huge boom. But what it did do was it shifted the mix towards higher value added products, which I think is where one would want to see Ukraine going. And just some of the things that technical assistance projects and government officials thought should be successful haven't. I think you people in the business association would be shocked to discover that governments, both in Ukraine and abroad, are not the best at picking winners and designating who should be a champion. But we've had rather unexpected successes, like something which is really cool, the Sherp Extreme ATV, a vehicle that is designed and manufactured in Kyiv, now co-branded through a Canadian company for North American distribution. I saw Q1 2021 shipments up 600%. I at first was surprised to find in our stats, what is Ukraine doing exporting new vehicles to Canada? What's going on here? But it's a niche vehicle, it's a unique design, and it has now been picked up by a significant North American partner. And I think that there's a lot that could be done in those forms of partnership. So it's not a takeover, it's a co-branding. It allows the Ukrainian producer continuing autonomy, also in R&D, but expands the reach. So there's certainly lots that can be done on that. There's discussion now have started on expanding the free trade agreement to services and investment. IT services have actually, I think certainly from talking to business people in 2017-18, Ukrainian software exports to Canada were bigger already then than goods exports. So in designing any services agreement, you don't want to actually hem them in. So again, trying to improve things, you end up suddenly constraining a promising sector. And then an investment chapter, but for that you have to stop sort of raider attacks like the TIU Canada situation that do not build a constituency, shall we say, for expanding agreements with investment chapters. So I think Ukraine has generated some very interesting opportunities. It's a matter, to some extent, of Ukraine getting out of its own way in helping them further develop.
Well, brilliant. Thank you. And Anders, I mean, so is it where the is it really sort of steering clear of the sectors where the oligarchs are and where there's too much regulation, or is it something else?
Yeah, thank you for your question, and thank you for the invitation to you and to Nadia. My view is that the big problem is not the oligarchs. My view is that the big problem is the predatory state. The state needs to be regulated, and it needs to be checked. We see you are close to it, Anna, and you see that, and Brian, you see that it's really the parliamentarians. It's not the ministers. The ministers are comparatively innocent, in my view. And the big oligarchs are not that deeply involved in many cases, but it is smaller traders in the parliament who get involved, and then they can cause a lot of trouble. So my fundamental concern is rule of law, and you can put it into three different pieces. One is judicial reform, which is high on the president's agenda, but it's not clear that it's properly put, and that the administration is well advised. I think here the West should engage deeply in helping the president to get it right. And the second is the anti-corruption institutions, where I think by and large there is a clear understanding. And the question is rather whether the right side wins or not. And then the third thing that somewhat surprisingly now came to dominate Secretary Blinken's visit to Ukraine was corporate governance after the rather absurd sacking of the head of Naftagaz, that the acting Minister of Energy appoints himself head of Naftagaz and sacks the supervisory board and the management board, or the forces the management board. It's not sacked. And yesterday, that has not been much noticed, the OECD published a wonderful report, in my view, on corporate governance in the Ukrainian state companies of more than 250 pages. And as far as I checked it, it's very well informed, extremely well informed. It's a serious academic piece of work, and it's also a policy piece of work. And the fundamental thing is that supervisory boards should exist at the big state companies, and they should be given full powers, essentially over two things. They should appoint the CEO and the management board, which they don't do now. They propose, and the cabinet of ministers approve. And they should adopt the strategy of the companies and the financial plans. And here again, it is the same thing. The supervisory boards only propose to the cabinet of ministers. And then the OECD points out that there are 80 different bodies that control the 3,300 state companies. You can't have it like that. There needs to be some kind of central holding company, which should be under political control, but it needs to be one policy. And of course, all of these companies should be joint stock companies. That is what you need in order to have proper transparency. So I think that as it is now, corporate governance will be one of the main issues. But let me move back what I thought I should start with. What is not the problem is the macroeconomic stability. Ukraine looks pretty good now. Last year, Ukraine had a current account surplus of 4% of GDP. We have never seen that before. The reserves are larger than they have been for the last 10 years. Inflation is admittedly a bit high now at 8.5%, but we trust that the central bank will control it, so it's no major concern. And this is quite an achievement, that we are not concerned about macroeconomic stability, but we are concerned about governance instead. And then I think that Secretary Blinken's visit now was extremely useful. Of course, you have a main thing that it shows that the US, as Canada, Roman, stands with Ukraine when it comes to security and territorial integrity. But it also shows that the US is deeply engaged in getting Ukraine right. I'm not necessarily criticizing the European Union, but the European Union does not have the same decision-making structure so that it can act firmly and sharply. The EU is better when it comes to slowly grinding a place into the right spot. The US is better when it comes to pushing hard on the big issues. And I think this is what we are likely to see now, because the US has never had such a leadership that knows so much about Ukraine. Think of it that both President Biden and Secretary Blinken visited Ukraine 6 times. And each, and under Secretary of State for Policy, Toria Newland, who will probably be the main operator on Ukraine. She has been in Ukraine so many times. So we could see that President Zelensky was quite stunned how much these two people knew about Ukraine after his meeting, and said that he was very impressed, but perhaps it also causes some trouble for us. And I think that was just the right thing. And for you as president of AmCham, of course, the big question is, what can the US do? And I think that the US has been quite good providing financing from what was OPIC and is now Development Finance Corporation in providing investment financing. And there's a clear understanding here that Ukraine is a place where it's difficult to get ordinary private financing. Then the state should come in. And the US thinks so very clearly. Exim Bank is now open for Ukraine, which is important. While people don't pay much attention to it, there is a bilateral investment treaty concluded in '94 and ratified in '96, which is quite an important basis for investment. Nadia asked me before, shouldn't we have also a free trade agreement? I'm of course all in favor of it. Someone mentioned it for Canada. I don't think that it would do much, but I think that it would be a very good sign that if the US committed to a free trade agreement. Unfortunately, neither party here in the US is now very keen on free trade agreements. So what President Biden has said more or less is not for the next 2 years, even if he hasn't specified it. So I'll keep an eye on it. I'm sure you will do as well, and see if there's any possibility of pushing it. But that's what I would like to see next. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Anders.
Sorry, let me add one thing. What should we look for as a success indicator? And I would say foreign direct investment. Last year, foreign direct investment really collapsed because of the mess on the renewable energy market, where the Ukrainian state authorities did not pay. And then foreigners just stay away. So what I would really like to see is more foreign direct investment, and then we would also see more Ukrainian investment, and we would see more economic growth. So that's the key success indicator.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, who better to talk about foreign direct investment than Anna Derevyanko, who is the executive director of the European Business Association. So, I mean, we'll come back to the corporate governance, because I know Brian, I read Brian's editorial last week about corporate governance, which I thought was, so I think that we'll have an interesting discussion here. But Anna, on FDI, I mean, last year wasn't a good year. I mean, what are you looking at for 2021 in terms of foreign direct investment coming in? And, you know, what are your expectations and forecasts?
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you very much to organizers to for assembling this session. Obviously, we are all dreaming about FDI, and we'd like them to come to Ukraine, and we are longing for that year after year. And unfortunately, last year and a few previous years were not good enough for FDI attraction, and most likely this year will not be an exclusion, because let's be pragmatic, let's be open. It does not mean that we have recovered fully from pandemic. Yes, macroeconomic situation is under control, and it will most likely stay under control in 2021. But nevertheless, FDI are not coming. It's not because that macroeconomic situation is under control. This is good. But FDI are not coming because there is still very weak justice in the country. We need to see more clear and more radical steps towards introduction in Ukraine, fair rules of the game, fair justice and good governance. Without being these kinds of things happening, it will be very difficult to expect that there would be quite a volume of foreign direct investments coming to the country. Having said so, I can also echo what was said before me when it comes to the good success stories. I do agree that the country managed to attract a number of good success stories, and it has also a nice bulk of Ukrainian firms who converted themselves from small startups to big companies. It shows that even despite the fact that we have a weak rule of law and actually quite difficult rules of the game, but nevertheless, it's possible to develop business here. And what Ukraine really did well over these few dozens of years, I can tell you that it really made everything possible that business voice is becoming better. It means that the business can leverage and can impact things which are emerging in the country. It can really shape the decision-making process in Ukraine. And in case business would be equipped with new blood in the form of new foreign direct investments, it would be easier to change the situation for doing business in Ukraine. Because yes, altogether we would be able to push harder to make equality in the rules of the game. It will be possible, I am sure. And when it comes to expectations and forecasts of the business community for 2021 and next year, so far we are still conservatively optimistic. We are in belief that most likely financial results of companies will stay okay. They do not expect that there would be really rosy pictures, but nevertheless, they all expect that they will cope with their KPIs. At the same time, small business is not doing pretty well. Small business feels the worst, I would say, when it comes to the business components, because big and medium-sized business adopted to the situation, whereas small ones is suffering. But nevertheless, overall, I think that 2021 will show pretty good results when it comes to financial situation. But I would like to, again, to repeat that we in business community, we are all waiting for quite vivid and visible steps towards introduction of clear rules of the games, fair justice, proper court system reform, and which will enable effective fight with corruption. And we do hope that governance will be put in place in the country, because after all, governance and proper public administration sets a proper standard to keep up the proper pace of reforms.
Right. Well, I mean, just one very, very quick question, because I mean, today the fiscal authorities, they provided the latest numbers. So a million hryvnia in Ukraine, it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's $36,000. So there were 8,500 people in a country of 40 million that declared an income of $36,000 a year. So that's $3,000 a month. I mean, in Kyiv, there's like 3,300 people. I mean, surely that, I mean, what's wrong there? Is it that the people aren't reporting their incomes? Aren't they paying the taxes? Where is the problem in those numbers?
I think that, Andy, you know pretty well the situation when it comes to these numbers, and I will not discover something new, because in the business community, in white business, transparent business community, we are all complaining that some businesses are paying taxes and some are not, and nobody is liable for that because there is no proper prosecution when it comes to the break-in of the fiscal discipline. And we see a situation when obviously people are not willing even sometimes to pay taxes. I mean, those ones who employees, they don't want to be registered as employees in officially in companies because otherwise they would lose subsidies or something else. And this is quite a common practice in the country, especially in regions. But when it comes to transparent international companies, we set up the standard. We really follow all the fiscal laws and the proper legislation. We pay all necessary taxes, but it puts us in unequal rules of the game. We are losing compatibility to a certain extent. Though still, we continue to go this way and we continue to educate the population about the benefits of receiving salaries in white. But this could be actually the reason that taxes are not being paid, could be the reason why we have such a number, which you presented when you raised the question.
Okay, well, this is these numbers that just came up literally before this call. So thanks, Anna. I'm going to bring in Brian. I mean, Brian, tomorrow is Thursday, a new edition of the Kyiv Post. Just going back to what Anders was saying about corporate governance, it was a good editorial at the Kyiv Post. It was an interesting editorial, I'll say, in terms of that. What's your view about the corporate governance? Because I mean, do you agree, or I know maybe 2 days away, so we're waiting, and we've had another.
You're breaking up. Can you hear me okay?
Announcement today from the G7.
Right. You can hear me okay. Well, okay, we'll start with NAFTA. We can start with Naftogaz then. Yeah, I took a contrarian view and I heard from my friend Anders Aslund about that. But my view was that this board wasn't, the independence of any governing board is largely determined by who picks them and how they pick them. So I question whether this board was really independent. They seem quite loyal to Kobolov. In fact, I interviewed Claire Spottiswoode that's one of the things I have yet to do to get in there. She thinks Kobolov is just great. How is it that, I mean, and then we got to talking about the nitty gritty and we talked about why you allow billions of dollars of gas provided to a customer, mainly Dmitro Firtash, to go uncollected. She said, it's out of our control. We can't do anything about it. Well, then why do you allow the regional gas networks that distribute gas to be almost monopolized by Dmitro Firtash? That's the energy regulator. So tell me, what is the independence there? I mean, I don't see that they were operating fully independently. That's one thing. The other thing is, I mean, the shareholder, you talk about private industry, the shareholder is not going to give up its right to appoint the CEO, appoint the governing board. It's just not going to happen. And so actually the letter of the law was followed in this case. We'll see what happens. Both sides have staked out, positions where the other guy is evil. We're soon going to go back to Kremlin control of Naftogaz, et cetera, depending on who you believe in. I think we'll know the results, but I mean, this is a company that lost $500 million, hasn't increased oil and gas production, hasn't restructured. You can go on and on down the list. The thing that they did do great, and actually Vitrenko was part of it, is they did litigation that got billions of dollars from Gazprom. And Vitrenko, as he says, was willing to push for more. So, I mean, I just want to go through, I understand what the G7 is saying. So it's not their business to pick who runs state-owned enterprises, okay? They want a transparent process. They want independent professional governance. One of the big things that, and I wrote about this in the editorial, was transparency. Well, because of Groisman's attacks on Kobolos compensation, this year in their financial report, they lumped all the compensation for the top 17 people into one group, 25 million, double the compensation of the previous year, which was profitable. So they double the compensation of a company that loses $500 million a year. Then they don't break it down individually. Who gets what? That's not transparency, folks. So I think we have to go back to the drawing board a little bit. And I did take a class at the Ukrainian Corporate Governance Academy, whose professor said the shareholder is never going to give up certain rights. So that answers that question. But Andy, do you have any questions?
Yes. Sorry, I've just switched to a mobile device because I'm in a place with the dodgy connection. So I think, I wouldn't want this whole panel to be overshadowed by the corporate governance, although it is a very timely.
No, let's not. But can I just walk you through a day in the life of the chief editor of the Kyiv Post? Tomorrow, we're going to, or in Friday's paper, we're going to print a paid advertisement from Ambassador Waschuk's successor, decrying a corporate raid attack with the connivance of the Prosecutor General's office on Ovastar, a big egg producer and exporter, saying nothing is happening. I mean, this is the ambassador of Canada. This is not a radical, fringe person. So that's one issue. We don't have much paid advertising, but this one is the paid advertising in the paper. The other thing is we have World in Ukraine, Great Britain. I interviewed the ambassador there, and she said we're not going to get fresh investment, Brian, until we get rule of law. Every company that talks to me talks about rule of law and their concerns. Everybody on this panel has been talking about the same issue for 25, 30 years. So there's that, even though there's a free trade agreement. Well, there's a free trade agreement with Great Britain, there's a free trade agreement with Canada. Look at the trade figures. Neither are very high. So also, back to gas, the Naftogaz unbundled, and so now we have a separate company, the gas transit line. And I got done talking to Olga Belkova, and we have a story on that today. Unauthorized offtake, which is another word for stealing, but they don't call it that. It's a customer taking gas from the pipeline and not paying for it. Guess who hasn't paid for their gas this year? Dmitry Firtash's regional gas companies. For strange, complicated reasons, the gas transit company says that they cannot collect this money, which now amounts to more than $300 million. So I, again, respectfully disagree with Anders' point that the oligarchs have too little power. Or aren't powerful. That's ridiculous. Akhmedov is running the state railway into the ground because of low tariffs. Anders knows that. Anders is the one who told me to change tariffs. The independent supervisory board had to go through 8 or 9 state agencies. That's not independence from the way I see it. And by the way, Kolomoisky is still not charged with bank fraud. I rest my case.
Anders, would you like to comment?
Yeah, well, of course, Brian is right in many things here, but the fundamental thing is that the Ukrainian rules are so contradictory and so complicated. As Brian said here at the end, the tariffs for the Ukrainian railroads is a good example. We have to go through 9 state agencies to have them changed. And in the end, it's some ridiculous institution called the State Service for Regulation, that regulatory service that says, no, you can't do that without any unnecessary motivation. So the system really has to be changed. And if you take the financial plan, it takes half a year to get it adopted before the into the year for which the financial plan should be valid. And until it has been adopted, a state company cannot make any investments. So this is a reason, one of several reasons that Ukhrusalitznitsa steadily invests only half as much as it has planned. So it's a really an enormously complicated state. And then Brian takes here the point from our common friend Sergei Leshenko, arguing that the iron ore tariffs are set low to benefit Akhmetov. It's quite possible, but I don't know, because how this is being done is we have these wonderful Soviet tariffs, why not maintain them? And so you see a steady reluctance of the state authorities to change something, because it was a wonderful Soviet invention, and therefore they don't clean it out. And we as a supervisory board on the railroads had no right to do so. And moreover, we then go through the various ministers, Minister of Infrastructure, which is quite sensible, Minister of Economy, that is sensible, Minister of Finance, that is sensible. But then we go through the whole thing and nothing happens. That's what happens most of the time. So what the OECD points out in their corporate governance proposal is there should be one state agency or state holding company that is in charge of all the big state companies. It should be supervised by a senior government minister, but it should not be 80 bodies that supervise the state companies. So there's no consistency anywhere. It's simply a bureaucratic jungle. And whether it's oligarchs or small thieves or just bad bureaucrats who are causing it, I can't say.
Right. So I think, that there is, the above mentioned, I did try to start on a more positive note, but I think, that the mood is definitely, it's been an active couple of weeks. So, I mean, how do we balance this? Because there is bad news out there. There's a lot of bad news, but at the same time, that there's a lot of good news out there. And, our surveys, yes, definitely shows that the number one obstacle, 73%, I believe, they see the lack of rule of law as the biggest obstacle. But still, we see that 60% of our members are forecasting revenue growth in 21. So how do we balance? And maybe Ambassador Waschuk, maybe you want to take a jab at this. I mean, how do we balance, the fact that, for what Brian said, that the Ambassador Larissa Galaz, is putting out a full-page ad, highlighting the problems that the investors have. But how do we balance this, that companies that are looking Ukraine, with also sharing some of the good news?
Right. I think we need to find ways for not just foreign investors, but essentially the Ukrainian middle class to have skin in the game. Attempts to do this politically keep falling apart in Ukraine. Sort of your middle class liberal parties tend to arrive in parliament and then vaporize because everybody's way too smart for each other. But through projects that build confidence, because I think rule of law, the flip side of that is that Ukraine is a low trust society in many respects. And so trust appears fleetingly during moments like Maidan, and then it starts evaporating again. And again, to provide an example of what I think can counteract it is projects like Urban Space, projects like Promprilad in Ivano-Frankivsk, which I've signed on with in there, and 800 investors, big, medium, and small, ordinary Ukrainians mostly, believing in a project and making it happen, and it's tangible. I think that there's a need also for donor actors in Ukraine, and for example, on something like judicial reform, to be very closely in touch with you guys, with AmCham, with EBA. Government, and I have experience with this, government reform programs are often 5-year, 10-year programs. They get locked in. They can't react to changes that happen in a dynamic environment in Ukraine very well. they need the voice of people with their ear to the ground, people who are basically doing daily microeconomic monitoring of what the impacts of rule of law or its absence are. So supporting more examples of Ukrainians getting together and building trust. I think SUP as another organization, is important in that respect, so that it isn't just donor-funded activists and donor governments going to politicians saying, you must do this, or else the $10,000 reform screwdriver from Ottawa or Washington will try and fix your minute problem. That's kind of reform hubris. We need the broader based coalition on the ground.
Absolutely.
I can add from my side a little bit of not success, but positive picture. I think that despite of the fact that everything seems to be very unstable without proper rule of law, but nevertheless, we see complete change of all business models and models in general in Ukraine, likewise in the world. The speed of digitalization in Ukraine is enormous, and we see so much of undergoing changes both in the government and in business that is really fascinating. We have actually DIA city, DIA in general being launched in Ukraine, and the government tries to encompass all state services into this digital portal, this digital platform, and we really welcome that. And when it comes to the businesses and digitalization and businesses, we see also a complete change of culture of business entities. Whereas previously, before pandemic, everybody was working in the office from 9 to 6 minimum. Nowadays, it looks like that majority of people are sitting at homes and they are working from any place of the world, providing services to their companies. And it is pretty well actually received by all corporates, and they see more and more belief in their staff and their people. Plus, we see that actually innovations are going forward in Ukraine. And we just recently had a forum with a few startups and a few innovators. And we see that actually they perceive Ukraine as number 3 hub when it comes to outsourcing after US and China. It means that the number of smart people in Ukraine is really huge, and they are tending to stay here in Ukraine working for the globe rather than move to US or to other countries and live there. So basically we see actually quite tectonic changes in Ukraine, which allow Ukrainian businessmen, and not only Ukrainian but international businesses, flourish and develop despite all those quite worrisome, I would say, things which are still going on in the country.
Absolutely. Well, I think like the sectors, Anna, as you mentioned, IT definitely, agriculture, retail, food and beverage. I think, we are definitely seeing good signs and good profits in those sectors. And Brian, I mean, why is it that you think that, we can see this successful IT being a success and others also, but we can't see that in energy or, potentially some other sectors? I mean, is it, again, what do you think the reason for this is?
Well, I mean, I've been coming and going for 25 years, and obviously things have gotten better. We at the Kyiv Post wish it were even better. It would only benefit us. We love living here, make this our home. But, we're still going through a long restructuring of the economy, and the major assets have been held by a very few people who don't seem to have done well with them in terms of investment. And now other people are coming, but if we don't have the roads, we don't have the public transport, we don't have the schools, I'm not sure how long they're going to stay. So right now we do, as Ambassador Waschuk said, I mean, we are the freest probably, or, among the freest of the ex-Soviet republics. And I even don't use that word much anymore. I really view Ukraine as independent, but we still, have all these identified problems, and we're not doing it to be negative or pessimistic. It's just that if we tackle these problems, we're talking billions and billions of dollars a year that will flow to the state that can be used for investment and schools and everything else that go with making a nation great. So we need to restructure. I mean, obviously, it's been written about. Everybody here in the panel knows about this. I mean, green energy, you don't do the bait and switch where you promise somebody a rate, you get them in, they sink their investment in, and then you end up cutting them. It's just not, it's not going to attract investment. Fortunately for Ukraine, green energy costs, as I understand it, are going so far down that they're becoming attractive on their own. There would be no need to pay a green tariff. Now, Nord Stream 2, we've been adamant about stopping that, and I have to say that, I hate to be the guy who's I love the Blinken visit, but what we didn't see from the Blinken visit was more sanctions against Nord Stream 2. It seemed like Biden has chosen Germany over Ukraine and is going to go ahead with Nord Stream 2. Now, as some wiser people than me have pointed out, maybe this is a good thing because, in the long run, because Ukraine needs to get out of its gas and oil dependence in the energy sector. And as I understand it, green energy provides the best. Once you get the storage problems and the grid fixed and all the other things that need to be fixing, it provides the best opportunity for decentralized cheap energy. Imagine what the quality of life would be if that ever happened.
Yeah, well, Anders, if I can bring you in, as an economist, in terms of the companies in the IT sector, $5 billion of exports alone last year. I think with the retail and, traveling around the country now, seeing a lot of retail coming up, a lot of it's going online during the pandemic. But, again, the economic model, yes, with the oligarchs very much in the energy sectors, the television stations. How do you change that?
Yeah, that's a good and important question. This is what we're all asking. So if you take the two big old sectors, energy, that's for oligarchs who controls the energy sector plus state companies, and much of the metallurgy is controlled by 3 oligarchs. So this is really the situation. On the other hand, you have big economies of scale in these sectors. So you do want to see consolidation. By international standards, these companies are not big. So what do you want to do? You want to open up the market. It's to liberalize the economy fully. And of course, Brian is right that we have to get the tariffs right. Energy tariffs and railway tariffs. But to turn to what Anna said before, I think that we should very much look upon it. The big advantage Ukraine has is that it's open. It's possible to do things. All of a sudden something happens that we hadn't expected, not necessarily good things, but also good things. And the problem is too little stability in the legislation. One would like to see more inertia being introduced in the system, as what Brian brought up about the green tariffs. The green tariffs were introduced, was in 2012 under Yanukovych, very much to the benefit of Andrei Kyiv, and they were enormously high. And then later government says, sorry, this is too high. We should do something about it, but they don't do anything about it in the time. Many other countries have had too high green tariffs and they have done something about it. And instead they insist on not changing, rather they insist on not making decisions. And then they end up in big mess. So it's really a dysfunction of the government that I see as the fundamental thing. And as the government functions now, it's essentially two institutions. It's the presidential office that really decides everything. And then you have a Rada that comes in every so often. The cabinet of ministers plays very little role. And the cabinet of ministers now, Zelensky, I think, has been far less important than at least for the last decade. I mean, it was more important than Yanukovych and under Yatsenyuk and under Groisman than it has been last 2 years. The cabinet of ministers in Ukraine should basically be in charge of economic management. The presidential office does not have a capacity to handle it, and therefore we are seeing these rather, should I say, arbitrary or amateurish decisions.
So on that point, I think you've answered maybe, but what if you are advising President Zelensky, what 3 things would you advise him to boost economic growth in Ukraine today?
Judicial reform with a proper advice, keep the anti-corruption framework firm, take corporate governance further, and of course not to touch the national bank, but I think that is reasonably sorted out.
Brilliant. Ambassador Waschuk, what would your 3 pieces of advice to President Zelensky on economic boosting the economy? What would they be?
I would say give people a medium-term goal. I think one of the reasons people, apart from IT people, leave Ukraine is they don't see the country as actually going somewhere. You talk about Euro-Atlantic integration, but there's no, you don't need another Vision 2020 or a 5-year plan, but you need to have some national KPIs that give people a sense that they're all moving towards something together, whether digitization is a sort of national process goal, that's possible. I heartily agree with rule of law, and the other thing is, and also with the curious idea of inertia as a good thing. In other words, predictability. So predictability in the everyday, but with some medium-term goal to which you can move under rule of law.
Anna Derevyanko, if I can ask you the same, your top 3 pieces of advice to the president.
The first one is judicial reform. Obviously, we need to have clear rules of the game and rule of law in Ukraine. But the second would be also echoing what Roman was saying, KPI. But I would say that actually KPIs for the government, clear KPIs, which would be measurable and comprehensive, both by the government and also by people, so that everybody understands where we are heading for. And when it comes to the performance reviews, I would say that of those KPIs, I would say that it would be also necessary to introduce a proper remuneration of state officials, so that they would be incentivized in normal way, actually, to complete those KPIs. Without that, without proper remuneration and without proper KPIs and judicial system, it will be very difficult to expect that the reforms will be moving forward.
Super. And Brian.
Okay.
Brian.
Well, what those guys said, and then I'll just not repeat myself. We still have to sell off state enterprises, do it right away. And it's complicated, but it's not. Andrei Boytsin puts out a state-owned enterprises weekly. And the one that caught my eye is the one I most easily understood. The Ministry of Defense owns hotels. One of them is Kazatsky Hotel in a prime location on Independence Square. For 4 years, NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, found that guest bookings, money, $423,000 in guest bookings went to the private bank accounts of officials. How is that possible? I mean, in any normal country, why is the defense ministry owning hotels? Why isn't there prosecution for any of that? It makes no sense at all. De-oligarchization. Now, early on, and people forget about this in the early on, but Zelensky kind of poo-pooed judicial reform, said it's going to take too long. We're going to build roads, that'll be faster. But you don't really, that does take too long, because you get the higher Council of Justice, and you got the Commission for Selecting Judges, and you got the Supreme Court, and then you got the Constitutional Court stand up. Charge Kolomoisky. The US lawyers have done their groundwork for the prosecuting. You can't put together a criminal case against Igor Kolomoisky. That will send the signal to all Ukrainians that we mean business, because we're going after the biggest guy on the block. That's the second thing I would do. And the third thing is transparency, free press, continue to be free. One of the best things, I'll end on a positive note, Andy, because you got me in a better mood, is that what it looked like Zelensky's presidency was tanking was when he actually came alive and actually did something, did end run around the distrusted courts, rediscovered the National Security and Defense Council, made the toughest rhetorical statements against oligarchs, on and on and on. It looks like he's actually, and we're watching with great interest to see what happens with Medvedchuk's arrest. So whatever he did, it's Ukrainians have responded according to the polls, because his ratings shot up. So I think, are those enough for you?
That's a great one. No, and that's a positive note. So thank you. And I don't know, Nadia, I understand we've got Marcy Captor that's just joined us. Nadia, do you want to introduce Marcy, or shall I? Because I've had to switch to my mobile phone because I've got dodgy Wi-Fi, so I'm on my mobile network. But I can't see Marcy Captor. Are you with us?
I haven't been notified that she's with us. Marcy, are you with us?
There's Captor staff.
Okay. No, I'll introduce her. Maybe for another time. We have focused on regional economic development, and is this, in terms of the views of the panel, one of the mechanisms to sort of break away control from the central government and let the regions? Here in the United States, it's the governors that grow the economy. It isn't grown from the Department of Commerce or Washington. So is this possibly one of the answers to some of the issues that we're facing?
I think decentralization in Ukraine is not at the regional level, it's at the sort of municipal level. And it's actually, I think, worked quite well. And it has put in place a number of the right incentives for local authorities to seek investment and not simply rent seeking, but actually get taxpayers into their jurisdiction. I think in Ukraine, moving it to the regional level begins to look a bit iffy, just because of the Donbass issue and other regional tensions. But decentralization as it's being run now, I think, has a lot of promise.
I misspoke to say just the regional. You're absolutely right, Ambassador Waschuk. What we're seeing also, that it's often the mayors that are promoting international investment, and a lot of the successes are coming because of the actions of the mayor, not necessarily the governor. So
yep.
Point well made, thank you. So I don't see Marcy Captor as yet. Andy, did you somehow get a message that she was on?
Her name is on the...
Yes, I think I've just seen Marcy. Good afternoon, good evening. Are you with us?
She should appear on the screen. So
there, but muted.
I don't even see her on the screen. So thank you, panel, and we can we'll reconvene in terms of some follow-up action items that we might think about together. So thank you all.
Right. Well, brilliant, Nadia. On behalf of all the business community, thank you for the last couple of days for bringing everything together. A really stellar list of speakers. everything you do, boosting this US-Ukraine relationship, which is so important this time. So, you know, thank you to all the team at the US-Ukraine Foundation.
Well,
And
yes, excuse me. There's no way that we could put on this kind of event with a lot of good partners, and certainly the Chamber of Commerce, Andy, you have been one of those partners with whom we have been working to make this event happy. So again, thank to you, and I think we will continue to cooperate and do good things in the future.
well, brilliant. Well, thank you to our panel. So thank you, Ambassador Waschuk, Anders Aslund, Anna Derevyanko.
Andy, before we conclude, the Congresswoman is joining very shortly.
Okay, all right.
Brilliant.
Well, if you just stay on, you can do your video, put your video and audio off, but just stay on, and then you will be. I see, Marcy. Hello.
Hello.
So, Marcy, thank you so much. This is an incredibly busy time for you, I guess, with appropriations and the like. So we're very glad that you found the time to meet with us. I am not going to take a whole long time to introduce or go over your bio. I think most people know that you are probably the best long-term friend of Ukraine from the first time you came to Congress through to present. You also chair the Appropriations Subcommittee on Energy and Water Development, and of course, also on the Defense Subcommittee. Today's panels are things that are near and dear to your heart. We had a discussion on energy, agriculture, biofuel, just now an overall discussion about the best way that we in the West can help Ukraine in its economic development. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Marcy Kemp.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you and the US-Ukraine Foundation for being such vigilant supporters of liberty in Ukraine. I can't think of an organization that has given more or tried harder. And thank you to all your guests. And I apologize for not being able to be here earlier in the day, but just will give a few comments. Of course, I've said it in many places. Ukraine is the scrimmage line for liberty in Europe. I just got off a call with the foreign minister of Spain, and I actually was making a plea for the women of Ukraine who are feeding Ukraine today, even in the occupied areas, and asking for the European Union's help in trying to see those who literally are the lifeline of Ukraine today. I am very, very concerned, as you are, about Russia's very aggressive actions in Ukraine, now staging tens of thousands of troops at Ukraine's border and trying to threaten Ukraine both on land and sea. What are we doing to make a difference? First of all, the United States is keeping its commitment to Ukraine, and I think with President Biden fully understanding what is at stake in Ukraine, and Secretary of State Blinken recently visiting Ukraine in the first 4.5 months of the president's administration. That is a very good sign that the United States will continue its assistance and deep commitment to the people of Ukraine. On the financial front, and you've been talking about innovation and partnerships, I had Nicholas Kazvini-Gore, who's sitting just to my right here in the office, secure some numbers for me. So I'll place on the table. We have given in this current fiscal year $275 million for Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. That was an increase of $25 million from the prior year. And importantly, in the area of anti-corruption and development assistance of organizations that can actually manage the internals of Ukraine, the United States has provided $255 million, which is a $5 million increase. So to those of you who are listening or will view this later, it's really important for institutions here in the West to link to organizations in Ukraine that are corruption-free and help them advance. For example, I recently had a letter, an email from a young teacher in Ukraine who wanted a whiteboard for her classroom. And honestly, I can't ship her one here from our country because I'm not sure that the computer systems would match with what Ukraine has. But our embassy has to be much more on the ground with the assistance that it gives. And we are referring many of these requests to them right now. And I would urge those who are listening and who head organizations that can create partnerships in Ukraine, whether those be in education, whether they be in health. We've just had a tremendous health partnership between doctors, Ukrainian-speaking doctors from the United States and doctors in Ukraine serving the Ukrainian military. These kinds of binational partnerships can really make a difference. And with Zoom and with all of the electronic technologies we have now, it helps so very, very much. Certainly in agriculture, help to the women of Ukraine who are feeding Ukraine, helping us find ways to get good seed to them, to help them to partner with one another, to look at export markets. I know it sounds like a lot to do, but with, someone just said to me, if we had a feminine foreign policy, the feminization of foreign policy, where at least half the money had to go to organizations run by women, we might get further ahead. It'll be interesting to see. And that would certainly fit the prescription for Ukraine's agricultural sector. In energy, which I'm deeply involved in, we are looking for partnerships with Ukraine to help it bring forward its own energy, not just dependent on gas that comes from other places, but using geothermal, using solar, developing hydrogen technologies. Partnerships in the sciences can go very, very far. And biogas, ethanol. There are so many opportunities for Ukraine internally, oblast by oblast, region by region. This can really make a difference. And I'll be open to comments or communications that relate to the energy sector directly. My last trip to Ukraine was actually in 2014 when I accompanied President Biden and then Senator John McCain to the inauguration of President Poroshenko. And I remember that trip, especially because of the hope I saw in the eyes of the young people of Ukraine. And of course, we've just celebrated the 6th anniversary of the Maidan, and we know what has been given to get us to the point we are today. But Ukraine must focus on corruption in various sectors. And I think by partnering with Western interests at different levels, we can really help make a difference with the people who have the motivation and the desire to modernize. So I just thank you very, very much. Again, I want to thank the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken for his immediate attention to Ukraine. And I hope to see you all in person when it is safer. Tomorrow we are hosting one of the new parliamentarians from Ukraine. And I should probably tell you that we are working very hard with the Rada to establish a Rada research service so the parliamentarians in Ukraine can have very timely information to make sure that members of parliament can serve their constituents and have fully informed policy decisions. And we have had a tele-exchange between our Congressional Research Service and that of the Rada. And we look forward to continuing funding for the USAID Rada program to carry forward the Rada Research Service. And we are doing everything that we can on our end to work on exchanges directly of parliamentarians from Ukraine. One will be in my office tomorrow. And Alicia Zabaruna, who had been a professor of agriculture, and I have arranged a small lunch for her with members of Congress here from both political parties so they can meet her and hear her ideas about what else we might do to assist Ukraine. So our caucus here in the Congress is over 50 members now, and we're very excited about that. And there's a lot of support for Ukraine here inside the Congress, and we believe we have made the difference in terms of Ukraine becoming a secure, democratic, prosperous, and free nation. We're trying very hard. Thank you so very much, and we will welcome any questions now or later. Thank you.
I need to, okay. Marcy, since you brought up Lasha, and I knew she was going to be trying to come here, I have to tell you, you know, she spent some time with you, forget, a few years ago in your district. And, you know, she's now a member of parliament. And what she told Markian is that when she first was with you, she didn't quite understand all the things you were doing in terms of serving your constituency. but now she has, you are her model, role model and mentor. And she has done quite a bit in terms of mobilizing businesses. She has I guess the poorest district in Kyiv that she represents, and she attributes that to you. So I thought you'd like to hear that. So Marcy, there's a lot that has come out of this conference, and there's no point in just having conferences where you throw out a bunch of ideas and then, wait for the next conference. We are pledging to take a lot of the discussions and put forth more specific recommendations regarding economic development. You're well aware that our Friends of Ukraine Network has been working, the National Security Council has done a lot of work in terms of detailed work about what needs to be done. And we are planning to replicate that level of detail because there is so much in all the sectors that you mentioned. And it is both, it's encouraging. And I think we need to know where there are success stories and where are there opportunities, to help. Yeah.
Right.
And specifically this last panel, there was some discussion about, what's the best way to organize our assistance. And of course, there are challenges because of the process, by the time a project is approved and it's approved for 5 years, sometimes the environment changes and it's challenging to adapt to the new environment. However, I think it's something that's worthy of discussion and see if we can find any kind of solutions to that issue. So,
Well, I'll tell you, Nadia, on that point, might I just say, I can list a couple projects and maybe someone will be listening and they can contact me. But many
Okay.
years ago, Ohio State University founded an Ohio farm in Ternopil, Ukraine. And the farmer there was Vasil Shuliak. He is no longer living, but his son is living and is farming that land. They have had all kinds of issues, obviously, with the government of Ukraine, with oligarch interference. And I would love to establish that relationship in some way. With Licia coming here to the United States, I'm hoping that she's going to travel to Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, where they have a organization, a private foundation that is interested, I guess, in agricultural development. But
oh yes,
Shuliak is a medium-sized farmer. He's not an oligarch and he's not a peasant farmer. He has a respectable operation. He even had electronic media in one of his rooms following the international markets, but obviously Ukraine can't easily join those markets because of the corruption and issues that attend to doing business in Ukraine. But I would love to have someone assess his ability and his friends' ability to grow their own operations in Ukraine. It's been really hard because of the interest rates. And I've wondered about financing packages that could somehow help these people that are trying to function. Another problem dealt with credit unions. And I have no idea if any of those still exist in Ukraine, but have an assessment of what we can do, if anything, to allow the credit union movement to grow and flourish as it did in Poland. They didn't need any more help from the West. They were so able to manage their own assets. In the village of my ancestors, I mentioned this teacher who speaks English pretty well, but needs technology to help her reach more students, and informed me recently that some decision by the government of Ukraine, I guess, or by the Oblast government, I'm not sure, has threatened the very existence of their grade school and high school. And I'm saying to myself, what is going on? We have no Peace Corps worker there who can tell us what is happening. So I better understand the context in which she is writing me. And my sense is that the conditions at the village level are becoming more difficult. In that particular village, there is a brick factory that's functioned for generations. And I'm saying to myself, there would be a place for a brick company from the United States or Europe to take a look at what's there and say, is there a possibility of a partnership here? They make fire bricks that go in ovens. So it's a special type of clay called kaolin that exists in that part of the country. But you never seem to see any traction when you go and you look at what's happening. It's like the pieces can't be put together. So I think pick a number, 4, 5, 6, 7, 12 projects that we could each identify and then find people who could cooperate with us to analyze what's going on there and figure out a way to have a success. On the energy front, obviously, is an area where I'm extremely interested. And I still receive from Ukrainians mainly comments about, well, the gas will come from Russia, or the gas will come through the Three Seas Initiative, and that's okay. Ukraine is a country that can produce its own energy.
Yes.
I don't hear much conversation about that. And even if it's small in one place, whether it's Chernobyl and putting solar arrays there that would feed out, Ukraine needs to have a perspective of energy independence, and I would look for partners there. So those are some of my thoughts on projects.
Well, Marcy, I will share with Dick some of the discussions which actually address some of these things that you've raised. Regarding Ternopil, if you could send us the name of this farmer. We, as you know, we worked at the local level way back 97, 2007, and we continue to believe that economic development at the regional level is the way to go. And tomorrow, we actually have a couple of sessions to talk about whether it's the amalgamated communities or whatever. And there are a lot of companies that have settled in various parts of Ukraine. So there's a foundation. And Ternopil, we were going to have both the mayor and the governor of Ternopil, because they have several success stories about what they've done to attract investment. So we can see if we can find your farmer there.
Okay.
Just by happenstance, you mentioned this brick factory.
Yes.
Robert was on the West Coast, 2 years ago, and way before, and he met a lot of the new immigrants coming from Ukraine. And one was a family who has been very successful here, running a truck company, but now has gone back to rebuild a brick factory in their home area. So I don't recall where it is, but maybe we can. And they've been investing quite a bit of money to build this modern brick factory. So maybe we can connect them as well.
And you've reminded me, I met a family in Zhytomyr who run a honey operation, bee farmers. And they actually want to patent their technology outside of Ukraine. I haven't had a chance to help them do that, but they sell their honey in the region there. And they have like guest houses. People come, believe it or not, and they stay in beehives, and the bees are underneath and they buzz, and people sleep on these decks and they get energy from the bees. It's unbelievable, but it works.
Oh my
And yeah, and so they manufacture the horizontal panels that you put in beehives when beehives are collecting honey. And I thought, oh, in the United States, these people would be so wealthy. And I would love to find some connection to an American company or a Western company that could help them to realize their dreams. And so, if you unload me, I'll come up with a lot of memories that I have of places that I thought should at this point be flourishing, but because of the corruption in Ukraine and so many impediments, it's so hard for them to succeed.
Well, I think, we've got some associations, the American Chamber of Commerce run by Andy Hunder, of course, the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council run by Morgan, and we also had somebody who heads up the European Business Association. And so maybe we could put feelers out about some of these things you mentioned, and perhaps they're aware of some companies that are doing it or are interested in doing it. But
well, maybe I could make a summary. I'll do a summary sheet for you of what I remember.
Well, you and I have been talking for decades about all the products that should come from Ukraine to be sold here. We'll go back to that, and maybe the timing is much more friendly for those kinds of things with the changes in the internet marketing, but also transportation and getting things to market. So maybe it's time to go back to some of those and revisit them.
Yes.
I don't see any other questions, or unless I'm missing. No. Okay, so Marcy, again,
Thank
it's
you.
great to see you. It's been a
Thank you.
while.
I
And
know.
again, as always, thank you for your time. Nick, it's good to see you. And we'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you, Nadia, very much.
you.
And thank Bob. You provide such a great service to Liberty. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Well, this concludes our session today. And reminding you that we have another session tomorrow with some very interesting discussions about from the IT sector, and also, as I mentioned, things that are going out in the regions. So please tune in tomorrow. Thank you. Good night. Dobranic.